science time. Today we're talking about genetics. Let's call it that. Genetics and evolution. Let me remind you that evolution is simply the change in the traits a species has over time. This, on a fundamental level, there is direct evidence for this, and so there's very little confusion or up in armsness about evolution as a thing. We can observe bacteria, because they have such a short life cycle, changing over time. We can observe that species developing new traits that are beneficial to it. The trouble comes, as you're aware, when we talk about macroorganisms, large organisms undergoing the same thing. There are several, I have a couple of videos at least now about my saying how this is not something that, in my opinion, should be a source of consternation for you, for various reasons. Primarily that I don't think that there's any problem with your taking the evidence that you're presented from all the aspects of your life and forming those into one idea of mind that works for you. That having been said, I'm going to present to you the evidence or the biological occurrences that occur within an organism that make it be the way it is. It's genetics, and we're going to relate that to micro and macro evolution. Okay? So first of all, you. Oh wait, not just you. All of you are made of stuff. Oh. You're all made of stuff. What are you made out of? Cells. Cells. You're made of cells. And and you probably are familiar with this because I think you talked about it last year in 7th grade. What tells the cells the way they ought to be? DNA. The DNA. So let's write that down first. DNA, which as you know is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid, we think of, especially at your level, and maybe kind of dumbing it down a little bit, as the instructions for the cell. There's more to it than that, and it's the deeper you get into this in the field that we call cell biology. Okay, still science time, talking about genetics and evolution, talking about DNA. Anyway, before I had unintentionally cut the video, I meant to make it picture-in-picture, but I pressed the wrong button. There we go. The kind of easy understanding is that it's instructions for a cell, but the deeper you get into what we call biochemistry or cell biology, the more you'll understand that this is a chemical process as opposed to, well, it is the beginning of a life process, but it's a chemical process. The way that the elements on the periodic table that make this up bond together forms how this functions. So DNA, we think of as the instructions of a cell, and what happens inside of your cells is that they have some DNA, and you have, as you know, your own DNA, which is separate from, or different from everyone else's, and not only everyone else's, but everything else's. You have different DNA from, for instance, a banana, or a mosquito, or a bacteria, right? You have different DNA from all the other organisms, not just all the other species, but your DNA is different from Colton's, or your sister's, or George W. Bush's. You have different DNA not only from every other species, but from every other individual organism. Your DNA is unique to you. And what the DNA does, its job is to split apart. DNA, as you probably know, looks kind of like this. And it's made of these individual, what we call base pairs. Each one of these little lines is made up of 2 base pairs, what we sometimes call nucleotides. And you need to write that down. Nucleotides. You see a relationship between this word, nucleotides, and the nucleic part of deoxyribonucleic acid. These base pairs are nucleotides, and they include, I have to look this up because this is not really my area of expertise. The nucleotides are adenine, which we abbreviate A. That's a good abbreviation for that. Guanine, which we abbreviate G.
That's kind of...
Cytosine, which we abbreviate C. And I think it's thymine. Yep, thymine, which we abbreviate T.
Those are lame.
So, what's that word below base pairs?
Nucleotides. Nucleotides. So each of these little lines that I've drawn on my DNA is 2 of them. So for instance, it might be, and only certain ones fit together. So it might be what we usually draw like this, cytosine and guanine fit together. And the other ones we draw usually with a little loopy. Adenine and thymine fit together. And it can be either adenine and thymine. One of these little lines can be either adenine and thymine, or it can be cytosine and guanine. Cytosine and thymine don't fit together. Cytosine and adenine don't fit together. It only fits with guanine. And so even though we only have 4 of these nucleotides, and they can only fit together in this certain way, DNA is so extensive, so it's long enough that over billions of these, your DNA is completely different from every other organism on planet Earth. We call a specific segment of these base pairs, usually groups of 3, we call a gene. Group of 3 base pairs. Because each group of 3 base pairs in a row codes for a certain, what we call amino acid. Codes an amino acid. Have you heard of amino acids?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this should be reviewed. You did most of this last year, right? Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
So a gene is a group of 3 base pairs that codes for me. So we set out, we look at a group of 3 base pairs. I'm going to try giving a specific example of one that would code for a certain one. If we have a code of CAA, which is cytosine, adenine, adenine, this codes for the amino acid valproic acid. I think it's valproic. Don't come at me if that's not correct. I know it starts with val because your book just abbreviates it val. I think it's valproic acid though. And this is a kind of amino acid. In a second we're going to talk about how exactly this happens, but what a gene is this group of 3 nucleotides, and how it happens, like I said, we'll talk about in a second, but it does make a certain kind of amino acid.
What?
So the genes become, or their job is to code a certain amino acid. And you have billions of these, and all the time they're coding these amino acids. How this happens is that you have a piece of DNA, so draw a piece of DNA, DNA, and through a process called transcription, you're going to write this down, transcription, it becomes this DNA, which you got inside of your cell. Where do you know where in the cell this exists? The nucleus. It's contained in what are called chromosomes. A big pile of DNA is called a chromosome. And you have 21 chromosomes. You all do. Not everyone does, but human beings in general have 21 chromosomes, 21 pairs of chromosomes, which contain their DNA. Billions upon billions upon billions of DNAs. And in the process called transcription, this DNA, each little each little nucleotide codes a specific type of RNA, which is a one-stranded version of this. RNA, can you guess what RNA might be short for?
Loxy 9.
Oh, 1 second. I mean, we looked
RNA.
You don't have to look it up. Don't look it up. Don't look it up. Guess what it stands for. If DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, what might RNA be?
Ribonic nucleic.
It's just ribonucleic acid. It's the same thing, but without the deoxy part.
Oh, that's kind of lame.
So the DNA splits. There's a special kind of protein that unzips the DNA, basically. It unzips it, and then each of the one base pair that's now showing encodes a special part of RNA. And that's called transcription. So the DNA encoding RNA is called transcription, and then this RNA, through a process called, I'm going to make this a different color, blue, through a process called translation, makes, each one of these has a little base pair, right? But only half of it. The DNA has 2 base pairs stuck together. The RNA each only has 1 little base pair. And it looks at this one gene, this set of 3 base pairs, and it transcribes an amino acid. For instance, valproic acid. So if this little gene here says CAA, cytosine, adenine, adenine, the RNA makes that into amino acid. Valproic acid in this case. So far, so good. Let me just review real quick. We have DNA just loafing around in our cells all the time. The cell the cell, through various chemical reactions, the cell effectively says, I need a new protein in order to reproduce or make a little Golgi apparatus or one of the other organelles. You're made mostly of proteins. Through whatever reaction mechanism, it says, I need a new protein. And so the DNA that you have loafing around in your cell gets unzipped, turns into a piece of RNA, and this specific piece of the RNA is translated into an amino acid, valproic acid in this case. There are lots of other amino acids. There are a certain number of them. 20 different kinds of amino acids.
What do they do after that? Like after?
Good question. So next, after it's amino acid, all these there's a little thing up here that goes along. It's like a little factory, and it zips along the RNA, and it spits out whatever, as it gets along, it spits out whatever amino acid was coded for in that set of 3 base pairs, that gene. So it goes along the genes, and it spits out whatever amino acid that gene coded for. And then because of the order of these, all these amino acids group together, and they form what's called a protein. So the amino acids group together to form proteins. This is the most important part, because this is what you're made out of, right? You know that you're about 70% water or whatever, but the stuff that makes you is the proteins. You've got fats, you have lipids, right? Those are fats. You have fats. Some of us have it more than others. I'm doing this. This is a funny thing. Ha ha ha, Mr. Khan, that's so funny. You have fats. Carbohydrates give you energy. The nucleotides tell your body what to do, but the stuff that makes you are the proteins. The stuff that makes you and not your cousin or your dog or a fish or a tree are the proteins. This is what makes life unique, is the proteins. And so even though we've only got 4 base pairs, and even though we've only got 20 amino acids, as this thing zips along, it spits out amino acid after amino acid, and they just kind of combine as they go. And the different kind of proteins get made from that. And then the part where this relates to this is that as all of this occurs, sometimes, at random, something goes wrong. Something goes not exactly as it's supposed to. The DNA has checks in it that make sure that it's being coded, transcripted, and translated properly, but sometimes something goes wrong, and that's called, you know what it's called? What's the verb for when? A mutation. So write that down. So a mutation occurs. A mutation occurs. A mutation can occur just by total random chance, but a lot of times it occurs because something has broken a little piece of this DNA. For instance, some radiation, or sometimes at random, which can cause cancers, but that's why radiation causes cancer. Some radiation comes in here and it breaks this base pair off, and that makes it so this goes badly, and that makes it so this goes badly, and that makes it so the protein is badly made, or not badly, but differently made from how it should be, how it usually is.
That's terrible, Mr. Kine.
During Hiroshima,
people got cancer.
well, yeah, some people would be pregnant, and then that baby would be born with like an extra.
Yeah, exactly. That's why, because the nuclear radiation had caused mutations in the gene that caused the protein to be translated wrong, which made that, since the baby was just a little thing, as it grew, that problem expanded upon itself, which made him have 3 eyes or horns or something weird like that. But a mutation is a random occurrence, occurrence of a change in, we'll just say a change in DNA expression. Guess what the result of this usually is.
3 eyes or death.
No, usually death. Usually death. Almost always death. In your body, because you're made out of trillions upon trillions upon trillions of cells, usually, almost always, not just 99, but probably 99.9999% of the time, when this occurs, which it does, another cell will signal, oh, my buddy's wrecked. You gotta come get him. And the white blood cell will come and eliminate him. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and people developed cancer on a large scale because that little mechanism where they check each other is broken down. But usually that cell dies because of a mutation. But sometimes, rarely, a mutation can cause an adaptation. An adaptation is a beneficial trait beneficial trait that results from not only mutation, but we're going to get to the other thing that it can result from. Beneficial trait resulting from a change in DNA is an adaptation. Now think about this. Think about this. How, when you have your individual cells, the individual cells that make you up, how do they reproduce? How do they multiply? How do they make you grow?
Mitosis.
Mitosis. If you're a bacteria, which only has one cell, how do you reproduce? Mitosis. And we call that kind of reproduction of an organism what?
Meiosis.
No.
Oh.
Mitosis.
No.
Mitosis.
What do we call the reproduction of an organism where it just splits and it has the exact same, or it should have the exact same DNA?
Mitosis.
No.
Asexual.
Asexual reproduction.
I just said that.
Yeah, I know. You just said it just now. I told you good.
Yeah.
So asexual reproduction, asexual meaning without sex, reproduction, occurs when the DNA of one parent organism is directly copied to the daughter.
Oh, why do you write so fast, Mr. Khan?
Asexual reproduction involves the exact copying of whatever DNA was in that cell to the next cell. That's asexual reproduction. So, if you're an organism, like a bacteria or a yeast, that only reproduces asexually, what do you rely on to evolve? If evolution is driven by adaptations, as we had talked about before, what do you rely on to evolve?
Evolution.
Only, no? Well, yes, but what do you rely on? What's the only way that you can evolve?
Time.
Not just the sun, but anything that causes a
Adaptations.
mutation. Anything that causes a mutation. And even though mutations are rare, they're designed to be rare. No. Hayden, stop. Even though mutations are rare, and the cell has ways to make it so it shouldn't mutate, and most of the time when a mutation does occur, the thing just dies, it's still, because there's so many of them and it happens so fast, it still changes over time. Some of them happen to develop adaptations, which allows them to evolve.
So.
But what's better is, well, I wouldn't say better. What's more complex is when sexual reproduction occurs. Sexual reproduction, then, instead of the DNA just straight up being copied, what happens?
You get DNA from two different...
Two parents. Yeah, I probably shouldn't ask questions like what happens in sexual reproduction, but you know, two parents,
When
both
two parents like each other are very
recombined,
much.
both contribute justice. Both contribute DNA, and the offspring is a what? How should I finish the sentence?
Wait, what is it?
Two parents both contribute DNA, and the offspring is a
Mix of both.
a combination of both.
What?
A combination.
Oh, they said an abomination.
No.
Oh my
Sometimes
God.
it is an abomination. I know.
Whoa, Mr. Guy.
Sexual reproduction. Two parents both contribute DNA, and the offspring is a combination of both. So in this way, organisms that reproduce sexually don't only rely on mutation to have an adaptation.
God.
Therefore, their evolution can happen at a more advanced rate.
Jeez, Mr. Kime.
Send the smoke to the new babies. God.
Yes.
When the kids are trying to get into your side, Mr.
I think that effectively finishes out what I wanted to talk about. Let's review real quick. Genetics is a study of how DNA does this, how it transcribes into RNA, how that RNA translates into proteins, and how those proteins affect the way the organism is structured. This relates to evolution because through mutations or sexual reproduction, the gene expression, the proteins that are made from genes can change over time, and that change over time in a species is called evolution. The other stuff about evolution, things like that the organism doesn't decide whether to evolve or not, that stuff we talked about in a previous video, so you can watch that again if you need help with that. That is in your book for this chapter, but rewatch that video if you haven't, if that's unclear to you. But all this is the genetic side of evolution, what's happening on the chemical, the biological and the biochemical scale of things. Cyrus.
So like, this is just an example. So you're at the pool, you get a sunburn from like, is that a mutation?
Yeah. So what happens, that's an excellent example. The sun, the cosmic radiation from the sun has come in, and it has damaged the DNA in your skin cells, and the other cells around them are like, No, he sucks now. This guy is bad. The guy next to me is doing a terrible job. He has had a mutation. He needs to be eliminated. And so your white blood cells, that's why it turns red, is because it's inflammation. Your white blood cells are like, okay, let's go get those bad boys, and they go get the bad boys, and that causes inflammation, which causes you to have pain and for it to be red, because those cells are dying because your body is killing them. Which is good, because if it doesn't, then they develop cancer. That's why the more time you spend outside and the more sunburns you get, the more likely you are to have skin cancer. Because what if one of those bands of white blood cells misses one boy, and then he splits, and then splits again, and it continues to split? Maybe the part of the DNA that was damaged in that bad boy was the part that tells him to stop splitting. In fact, that quite frequently happens. So he gets splits and splits and splits and splits and splits, and that's what causes a tumor, and that's cancer.
And
that's how cancer happens.
Great
cancer.
And the trouble with cancer, what makes it so hard, is what is that? What are those cells made out of?
Cancer.
Human cells.
They're the same exact DNA as all your other cells.
Did you know that?
They're the same, and so it's very difficult for us to treat it because it's the same stuff that you are. You have to be half killed in order to get that thing.
I've seen this.
Do you have questions beyond that? Instead of thank you, Cyrus. That's a good point.
Cancer can grow body parts.
That's gross. That's called a teratoma, but we're not going to talk about that right this
Yeah,
second.
it's
But do you have questions about how genetics and evolution relate to each other?
Yeah.
Leo.
Okay, back to the sunburn part. Why is it your skin, it gets all peely?
Because it's dead. It's like your skin is already, the top layer of your skin cells are already dead.
It's
But
like
what happens is the second layer down gets damaged, and then that has to slough off. It has to be removed because it's already dead. But where white blood cells go kill it, and then as it rises to the surface, when new healthy cells are built underneath, that comes off, and you're just like.
It's literally dead.
So what
Other
do
questions?
What do they do with blisters?
Like dead.
What do?
What-
That's just a more severe inflammatory response. More of the cells in that area have been damaged. Thank you. Other questions about genetics and evolution? Okay.
Science time.